Hey folks, my name is Nick Bernardo. I'm president of MyGovWatch.com, and I am pleased to present to you today's session, ICE Contracted Spending and Partners, brought to you by MyGovWatch.com. So, folks, I have a bunch of slides, but I can promise you that going through these slides will probably take me, I want to say 20 to 30 minutes. So I think, if people are running to lunch or kind of sort of joining us while they're on their lunch, you will be able to, this will be within a 1 hour window. And I know people will ask for this. People always ask, can I have a copy of the slide deck? No, you cannot have a copy of the slide deck, but I can do you one better. This session will be on YouTube in a couple of days. It will be on the MyGovWatch channel on YouTube. So if you check back Friday at the very latest Monday, you will be able to see all of the slides, hear everything that I have to say about this topic. And yeah, so it'll all be out there on YouTube. So we're going to start with just a quick promo. Obviously, this is for promotional reasons. So MyGovWatch.com is a website that aggregates government leads, not just federal government leads, but thousands of websites contain or list out what the government's currently buying, federal, state, and local. That starts with the federal government, but it goes to every state as well as the smallest school districts and utility authorities across the country. So we have a subscription model under $100 a month, where if you're in business and the government buys what you sell, federal, state, or local, you can hear about what the government is buying in real time. So, what is this webinar and what isn't this webinar? Okay, so let's just talk about that for a moment. This webinar was billed as an apolitical event. And I think that's important because it is a sensitive subject, and I want to have respect for, things that have been happening in our country over the last couple of months, especially. But I know there's tremendous demand for information about ICE budgeting and ICE contracting. So I just want to make some distinctions about what we're really talking about today in terms of like what is the focus of this area. Sure, you signed up for the webinar. You obviously read the description of it, but let's just sort of talk about that just briefly so that people understand like what will we be talking about and what is sort of outside the focus of what we're doing over the next hour or so. So we're talking about government contract spending at ICE and with the Department of Homeland Security. We're not talking about total spending. We're talking about contracted spending. Okay. And so the distinction there being if there is an employee in a cubicle, that's part of total spending, but that's not part of contracted spending. If someone buys, I don't know, 100 office chairs, that's certainly contracted spending. If someone is chartering flights to different parts of the world to move people around, that's certainly contract spending. So the focus here is on past contracting with ICE and DHS, and that is the red area of the little infographic we have here. And that is most of the presentation. So it goes all the way back to 2008. It's the earliest fiscal year for which data is available. And it takes us all the way up through the current fiscal year of 2026. Current opportunities, and this again is probably the last 15% of the presentation would be current and future opportunities. So current opportunities would be anticipated spending that is known, meaning the requirements are fully vetted. The public is aware that the government is buying something around a specific need. That those would be the current opportunities. And then at the tail end of the presentation, we're just going to talk about things that are in the pipeline with ICE, things that are expected to be in procurement, but that are not yet in procurement. So I just want to make the distinction among those three different areas. So we're going to start with major spending areas. Okay, so a lot of work went into this presentation. I'm pleased to say that this presentation is a hybrid of PowerPoint tech, let's just say from the mid 90s. So you're going to see some animation. You're not going to see a lot of animation. I know it can be annoying, but just a little bit of an animation to support some of the visuals and things we're doing. And I'm also pleased to admit that there is some data analysis that happened as a part of developing this content where I have been using artificial intelligence, human in the loop, human in the loop artificial intelligence, in which certain mathematical formulas, I allowed the AI to do some work for me and double checked, spot checked the AI's work and found that, yeah, I mean, the AI can do math. So you're going to see some stuff here that was created using AI, but most of it is pretty straightforward and not very complicated. So in terms of major spending areas, everything in the presentation talks about federal fiscal years. And so it's important that people understand the federal fiscal year starts on October 1st of the prior year and it runs through September 30th of the current year. And so what that really means is that we are in fiscal year 2026, which started on October 1st, 2025. And so I'll be reminding you of that throughout the slide or throughout the presentation. There will be little reminders in the bottom right-hand corner of, which fiscal years we're talking about and what do we mean by a federal fiscal year. And so there's the example of 2026. Just a reminder, we're talking about contracted spending, not necessarily total spending. And specifically, we're talking about spending in the context of a term of art in federal contracting, and that is action obligations. And so what some people who might, be of an accounting background might understand about the federal government is that it's generally on a cash basis, but not always on a cash basis in terms of how it reports numbers. So it's sort of a hybrid where some things are on a cash basis, some things are on a accrual basis. Action obligations, strictly speaking, are accrual. And what I mean by that is that the numbers reported in this presentation are based on dollars that are contractually authorized and committed within a specific fiscal year or years. So it's not necessarily money going out in a specific fiscal year. It's monies committed, legally binding dollars that must be spent within that fiscal year. So that's an important distinction. Another choice in the presentation, and this is in terms of making it easy for people to digest the content, is that we're presenting data based on different presidential administrations. And so when you look at the fiscal years, and this goes back to like fiscal year 2008, you'll see some data from fiscal 2008. That's under George W. Bush. So that would be under the George W. Bush administration. We also have data from fiscal 2018 to fiscal 21. And so that is under the Trump 1 administration. So, well, why would it be fiscal 18? Well, if fiscal 17 started on October 1st, 2016, that would not have been a Trump administration budget. So the first Trump administration budget would be fiscal 18 through 21. Then you have 22 through 25 with the same dynamic. So that would be the Biden administration, fiscal 22 through 25. And then the current Trump administration starts with fiscal 26. Again, October 1st of 2025 as the start of 2026. So you're going to notice that the presentation is organized around those distinctions and those windows of calendar years that coincide with individual presidential budgets. Everything in the presentation is related back to NAICS codes, the North American Industry Classification System. So I'm assuming a lot of people on this session today know what that is, but not everyone will know what that is. So just a quick primer on NAICS codes. So there's a series of two-digit codes, and this is all managed by the Census Bureau. And the code system came out through NAFTA in the 90s, replaced the old SIC system. If you're as old as I am, then you remember the SIC system. Basically, two digits being the highest level of classifying the spending activity. So for example, 56 is a two-digit code, administrative support and waste management and remediation services. So then you have a three-digit code for administrative and support services, four-digit code. So four-digit code would be like employment services. And then your five-digit code in this example gives you employment placement agencies and executive search services. And then the final six-digit code, and I'm showing you the distinction between employment placement agencies and executive search services. So they both roll up to the five-digit code, which rolls up to the four, the three, and then the two. As another example, we have waste management, which would be 562 instead of 561. You have waste collection, and then under waste collection, you have waste collection as well as solid and hazardous waste collection. So everything from this point forward will generally be looking at two-digit NAICS codes as well as four-digit NAICS codes a little bit later on. We're not going below that except for maybe a few anecdotes, but it's just important that you understand there is a hierarchy. Federal spending is tracked at the procurement or contract level with a single NAICS code. There are some drawbacks to that system, but I can tell you that by and large, the concept in databases is garbage in, garbage out. For the most part, the folks who are deciding which NAICS code to assign to individual contracting actions are doing a good job. They're not doing a perfect job. So do not assume that every purchasing action that would be in the data set covered here is accurate in the first place. However, it is accurate enough for our purposes in understanding what's happening with ICE and DHS contracted spending. So we're going to start with a quick table showing all spending areas. And what do we mean by all spending areas? So this would be every two-digit NAICS code from 2008, fiscal 2008 present to present. And we see here that we have several different two-digit NAICS sectors on the far right-hand side. And we see that two of the spending areas dominate the spending from fiscal 2008 to present. And that is spending, contracted spending in NAICS sectors 56, administrative support and waste management and remediation, as well as 54, professional, scientific, and technical services. So just like a quick summary of what those are, because we really have like the 80-20 thing happening here, where most of the spending is top heavy in those two areas. 54 is would be higher skilled professional services. So think legal services, accounting services, architectural services, so designing buildings and facilities. As you can imagine, there's a lot of spending around buildings and facilities and design of buildings and renovations in federal spending across all departments and agencies, as well as IT programming would also be under 5.6. I'm sorry, 5.4. 5.4 I'm sorry, 5.6 would be the lower skilled professions. So this would be things like call centers, collection agencies, but also things that are highly relevant to DHS and ICE, such as travel services, which we'll be talking about at length, guard services, so private security firms, even things like janitors would be under 5.6. So that would be support and waste management, remediation. Then you have things like 51. So that would be information services, anything from data services, database access for different things that ICE might be doing with data, video services, subscriptions, anything involving data or information services that might support the Department of Homeland Security or ICE mission. And then finally, I just want to mention 92. The others on here are fairly self-explanatory. Public administration. If there is some miscoding of NAICS codes in the data, I think a lot of it is around this 92 NAICS code, the top level NAICS code. So if someone were to code something incorrectly, they might code it under public administration and say that private guard services is corrections or police if it's security related. So at the bureaucrat level, the person assigning that NAICS code has the ability to incorrectly choose corrections or police, which are public administration NAICS codes, instead of what they should be, which would be private equivalents of those, which would be found under 56 for guard services, for example. So I think some of that is in error. And then we have 18 other top two-digit NAICS codes comprising about 8.5% of everything else. And so 2008 to present, when you look it up, ICE spending is about 8.5% of total DHS contracted spending. Okay, so now let's go ahead. We're going to look at fiscal years 2018 through 2021. So this would be Trump 1. And I have an asterisk here. So what this is 98% of action obligation spending. So it's not 100%, but it's almost all of it. And so we have the same codes coming up over and over again. So what you're going to see is a consistent theme where 56 and 54 are dominating what ICE is spending. And again, 54 being, let's call it white collar professions, lawyers, accountants, programmers, and what have you. And 56 being the blue collar travel, guard services, janitorial services, facility services, maintaining facilities, you name it. So between fiscal 2018 and fiscal 21, what we saw is that ICE contracted spending was about 7.7% of DHS contract spending for that window. So a slight decrease if you look at the overall years of 2008 through present, but the same activities dominating that spending, so north of 73% for those fiscal years. Then we'll look at major spending areas within 54 and 56 for 2018 through 2021. And what we have here are four-digit NAICS codes, or what we call industry group NAICS codes. And these would be the breakdowns of where the spending is happening within 54 and 56 in those four fiscal years on a combined basis. And you could see investigation security services, computer system design, facility support services, once again under 56. So anything from janitors to guard services, management, scientific, and technical consulting. So a lot of accountants, lawyers, what have you in that realm. And then other professional, scientific, and technical services. So that could be anything under the sun. Moving to fiscal 2022 to 2025, we see the same two-digit categories dominating the spending. And we see a change where the overall percentage of ICE contracted spending came up about a 0.5% from 7.7, I think it was, up to 8.2% of DHS contracted spending for those four fiscal years. But again, no real change to the story in terms of which two-digit NAICS codes dominate that contract spending. So at this point, we're well north of 74, 73, 74%. And yeah, so all of the same two-digit NAICS codes adhere, and this is close to 98% of the spending for those four fiscal years. Major spending areas for fiscal 22 through 25, again, the same story. So we're not seeing major changes in the fundamental top-heavy spending at ICE for 18 through 21 on one hand, and then 22 through 25 on the other. We're seeing the same major buckets of spending with some changes in the relative amounts. And that's what you probably are noticing about these slides. So if I go back for a moment, we see that, we see 4.1 billion spending for investigation and security services in 18 through 21. And then if we fast forward, a significant change there. However, it doesn't change the overall story, 5.9 billion in spending for the same category, 22 through 25. So a significant increase there, but they're still spending in the same areas, just in different amounts. And so there's some conclusions here we'll talk about later that where we go further with some conclusions. I hesitate to make a lot of conclusions in this presentation because I think there's a lot of room for interpretation of the data. I will make some statements near the end about what I think I see in the data, and I'll also let you know where all of this stuff came from at the end of the presentation as well. So fiscal 2026 spending areas. So this is 98.3% of all contracted spending, and this would be about 6 months of spending. So we're just within a few weeks of the end of the first half of this fiscal year. Again, the same top level categories coming up over and over again. But there's a significant change here. We see a 10.8% spend of ICE spending in relation to DHS contracted spending overall. Now, you might say, okay, well, it's a couple of percentage points. It feels a little bit more significant. We are seeing that a total or ICE spending, contracted spending as a percentage of total DHS spending is going up proportionally to other agencies at DHS. And so that we feel is significant. And if you even look at some of the dollar amounts in the obligated amount category, you'll notice that some of the dollars in the billions are fairly hefty 6 months into the 1 year fiscal year cycle. Major spending areas, again, this really hasn't changed, although we're starting to see more activity from 2022 forward in travel arrangements and reservation services, and that's going to be a lot of the chartered flights that we're hearing about that are moving people out of the country. So we'll certainly be talking about that as we go through the remainder of the slides. But yeah, the overall categories are not changing very much, even into the current fiscal year. And I think you can see that now across the three buckets. So again, fiscal 18 to 21, 22 to 25, and then fiscal year 2026 by itself. Growth over time. And so let's just see what that looks like. I promised you an animation, and here it is. So here we have contracted spending from fiscal 2008 forward. And so it covers everything from George W. all the way through to the current partial fiscal year. So I'm just going to take a moment there and let you absorb this slide, and we'll talk about what we see here. Hmm. What I'm seeing is significant spending '08 into '09, a change in strategy, if you will, between 10 and 17. And then it's pretty clear what's happening from 18 forward. Again, that 2026 bar off to the far right is a 6-month number. So you can see what's happening with the spending across the last 8 completed fiscal years into the current ninth fiscal year beginning in 2018. And so these again are action obligations. These are contracted amounts that are legally binding in which those actions occurred in that fiscal year, even if the spending itself, the dollars changing hands, happened in later fiscal years. Let's talk about some trends. By the way, folks, we're about halfway through the presentation. I am, looks like about 24 minutes in, so I'm going to pick up the pace a little bit. So the question I have in terms of trends, and I want to frame it as a question because it's for you to answer. Has ICE contracted spending, again, action obligations, as a percentage of total DHS contracted spending fundamentally changed? And I'm phrasing that as a question intentionally. So I would suggest to you, and again, at the end, I'll tell you where this data came from, and you'll be able to draw your own conclusions if you play around with the numbers. ICE contracted spending in 2026 looks more like 2022 through 25 than I believe either looks like 18 through 21 in terms of the mix of spending, the relative proportions of the spending in the 2 and 4-digit NAICS codes that we've been talking about. Certainly, there's a trend up starting in 2018, and that trend continues through the Biden administration and up through the current fiscal year. Certain activities are increasing proportionally versus all others and growing more sharply than others. And I will admit to you here that with tens of thousands of rows of data, this is sort of the perfect use case for AI. So I might have used my AI to help me figure out which 4-digit NAICS codes were growing at the fastest rate proportionally to the others. And I have to tell you, I did a lot of checking of the work, and I found the tools that are out there are fantastic. I don't believe that in the old days, when someone had a friend or a coworker who was the in-house expert in Excel, that person is being left alone now. There's no reason to email your friend or someone who works with you and saying, "Hey, can you help me figure this out in Excel?" Those days are over. It's all happening very easily with the AI tools that are out there. So other trends comparing 2018 through 21 to 22 through 25. Security services overall, 5616 grew substantially, and that's the largest share of activity. Facility support and IT systems design expanded as well, comparing the two periods. Travel and logistics services increased sharply, comparing the two. And then if we only look at fiscal 22 forward to include 2026, travel arrangement and reservation services show a significant proportional growth. And after reviewing the AI's work and looking at the data, it was right. I mean, you can clearly see that the logistics around moving people out of the country has become a much larger line item in ICE budgeting from 2022 forward. So not since 2026 or 2018, but particularly a sharp growth in that beginning in 2022. Investigation and security services becoming a larger share and growing as well. So now I have some heat maps showing contracted spending by state and region. So let's pull up the first one here. So this is all dates. And all dates would mean everything from fiscal 2008 forward. And this heat map, if you look at the legend in the bottom right-hand corner, it's showing you that, for example, since 2008, over $6 billion has been spent in Texas alone. And that's, again, not total spending, but just contractor spending. And then you can see also as the colors become lighter shades of green, sorry for any of those who are colorblind, but we have other lighter colors where there's a lot of spending happening in California and Florida, and less so in Colorado, Arizona, and New York, but certainly some spending there. The reason why Virginia is dark green is that anything that can happen remotely would tend to be based on a place of performance with a beltway contractor operating in Virginia, where their activity can happen in a central location and support ICE operations nationally. So that's why you're seeing a darker color in Virginia. It's because of the proximity of federal contractors to DC in the Commonwealth of Virginia. So then moving forward, 2008, here's just an isolated snapshot of 2008. You can see there was a lot of spending in California. And you'll notice also, I'm going to go back to the all dates version of this, that pardon me, the legending in the bottom right-hand corner changes. So this is a heat map that is dynamically changing based on the total spending. So the scale in the all dates version of this map changes compared to relatively paltry numbers, couple $100 million or close to $200 million in fiscal 2008 in Texas, for example. Those numbers are changing relative to the dollars spent in that fiscal year. So then fast forwarding to 18 through 21, we can see again some increases or some probably, I would say, more concentration in fewer states. So I'm going to keep going back and forth, and you could see that dollars were maybe spread out a little bit more among, 15 or 20 states back in 2008. And it seems like maybe that became a little bit more concentrated between 18 and 21, and the scale going to $1.4 billion in Texas for those 4 fiscal years combined, for example. And then 22 through 25, again, we have some concentration. Maybe the concentration is a little bit more along the border between 2022 and 25. So we still have Virginia as a juggernaut, and I don't think that would ever change. Again, for the operations that can happen remotely in support of what ICE is doing. But you can see certainly some more concentration along the border states between 2022 and 25. And then finally, current fiscal year, certainly more concentration in Texas compared to California in the previous map or even Arizona. But again, this current fiscal year of 2026 would be about halfway through the total or the full fiscal year. Top contractors. So this was sort of billed as what people really wanted to know about in this event. And there are literally thousands of contractors that would be a line item in any federal agency's reports for contracted spending from year to year. We can't show everyone, but we could certainly show the top contractors and see what's been changing over time. So we're going to look at 2008 through present. All right. And so this is a list of, I believe, the top 20. And you can see amounts starting with the Geo Group at almost $5.2 billion. And that again is 2008 through present. So this is a large data set going back as far as is readily available to the public. Let's put it that way. And you'll see a lot of these names are the same in later versions of this slide for different fiscal years, but there are some changes. And what also isn't captured in this report is that different companies can have subsidiaries, and those subsidiaries may be separately reported in the data. So there, some of the numbers might be even bigger, for example, and this is just a hypothetical. If the Geo Group had a subsidiary by another name, additional spending may not be reflected in this, but is available publicly, just not reflected in these numbers in particular. So fiscal 18 through 21, we see the same top contractor, the Geo Group, but you'll notice that there are some changes in terms of, who is showing up on this report. Top contractor at 1.7 billion. So we have three contractors over $1 billion in that 4-year fiscal year period. And then for 2022 through 2025, a significant change. I would call this significant. So we saw that the percentage of DHS's budget, ICE spending as a percentage of DHS went up for those 4 years. And we see also here that the top contractors, or the number of top contractors exceeding $1 billion, is now five instead of I guess in the previous slide we had just three. We have five now. And yeah, so some of the names would be the same, some would be new. But we're going to go back to the AI in a minute because I was able to use AI to figure some other things out. And we have a slide on that as well. And then for the current fiscal year, we already have one and almost two contractors that are over $1 billion. And if you look at the numbers here, we should certainly have five or six of them over $1 billion once all is said and done after this fiscal year ends on September 30th. Contractors gaining, and this again, folks, this was an area where um, because there were tens of thousands of rows of data, I was able to use a tool. And I just don't feel like I need to name the tool because, hey, everybody should pay for advertising, right? But I was able to use a tool and just ask the tool, hey, tell me who is gaining ground looking at three different data sets. And it was able to look at three different data sets, 18 through 21, 2022 through 2025, 2026. And it was able to tell me which contractors are gaining ground. And so these would be companies that would be able, where you would be able to see that growth if you were to do individual reporting. And again, you're able to do individual reporting on the tool that I'll tell you about at the end of the presentation to show you what dollars are being paid out to individual companies. And you can see that growth over time as well. But the AI tells me, looking at tens of thousands of rows of data, that these are the 10 contractors that are gaining the most ground over the last 5 years. And so we are 35 minutes in, and I have about five more slides, folks, or just a handful more. Which NAICS codes are gaining the most ground? So 541614, physical distribution and logistics consulting. So this is like transportation management. Like, this is moving people around in buses. This is like logistics around flights. And this is how do we move people around in a way that supports the mission. And that's what that NAICS code is. And that is certainly gaining ground in the last 5 years. Travel arrangements, so chartered flights would be there. Radio and wireless communications equipment. So obviously, as tech continues to evolve, government is spending more and more money around communicating interagency and intra-agency where it makes sense. So we're seeing significant gains around that NAICS code as well. Small business utilization. So every federal department and agency has small business goals. So we're just going to spend a moment on that. Historically, and this is at the department level for every federal department and agency, fiscal 2024 is the last year where the data is readily available on the SBA website. This is DHS data, folks. So agency level data is not readily available, but DHS generally hits the mark when it comes to small business contracting attainment, meaning they are exceeding what the government has as a goal for prime contracting spend with small business, as well as different types of small businesses, and we'll get into that in a moment, as well as subcontracting goals. So they tend to exceed those as well, and a few other areas of the scorecard. And we're going to look at what those are. So there's prime contracting. So all of these numbers tally up to the 119.79%, um, where in which DHS exceeded their goal of 100%. So 62.19 in prime contracting exceeded their goal on that. Subcontracting, 26.4. They have something called the OSTABU compliance requirement, and so that's like 20% of the goal. And that's just basically, is there a part of DHS that is focused on the Office of Small Disadvantaged Business Utilization? Do they have sufficient infrastructure to make sure that small businesses are aware of contracting and subcontracting opportunities? So they hit the mark on that. Number of small business prime contractors comparing the current fiscal or the two most recent fiscal years. And that's the other part of the scoring. So I just wanted to give you a visual from the scorecard showing you just that last part. So fiscal 23 versus fiscal 24. And this is again DHS, not ICE. So this is ICE would be a part of this. So it looked like close to 5,000 small businesses supported DHS's mission in fiscal 23, and they exceeded 5,000 small businesses in fiscal 24. And for those of you who don't know, the other parts of small business tracked spending in the federal government is around small disadvantaged business. So over 2,000 of those participated in 2024 in prime contracts. It looks like over 1,000 woman-owned small businesses participated, and that again is the blue bar for 2024. Maybe 500 or so service-disabled veteran-owned small businesses participated as primes, and then HubZone maybe under 500 in fiscal 2024. Contracts in the pipeline. So everything up to this point was historical, if you remember the graphic. And so we'll go to that right now. So just a reminder, and this is the cycle showing past, current, and future contracting opportunities. So we're getting into the purple section of the cyclical graphic infographic. And I might have used AI to create this cyclical graphic, which I think is just fine, by the way. I might have had to tell them a little things to get it to be the way that I wanted it, but I certainly am happy with the outcome. And I like how I took about 2 minutes and all of a sudden I had a graphic to paste right into PowerPoint. So current solicitations on SAM.gov. Here's what we have. Detention services. So obviously there are needs for additional detention centers where there's housing, there's guards, there's meals, there's medical care and transportation around detention services. Something called Implan, and that's economic modeling software. That is a sole source opportunity that's on SAM.gov currently. And that typically means they believe, or the buyer believes, that there's only one vendor who can meet the requirements that they have. Conductive energy weapons. And it's not listed as tasers on SAM.gov. It just says conductive energy weapons. And boy, I went right to Google because I couldn't even begin to imagine what that was. And it turns out it's just tasers. So that is a sources sought notice. And what we mean by that is that they may be setting the requirement aside for small business or woman owned or disadvantaged, and they're asking the market for information on like who has the capability to sell us these items, and that is out there on SAM.gov now. Meals ready to eat, and so MREs, that's something you might have heard about in a military context. Certainly has an application with feeding people when there's lots of people in a central location in a way that doesn't involve cooking staff. And then armed and unarmed guard transportation services is also a sources sought that's currently on SAM.gov. Contracting forecast, and this goes back to the green area. So that would be the green area of the cycle. There are 40 plus items that have been publicly announced by DHS around ICE. And so there are 25 new requirements and 16 recompetes in the part of the system where DHS has a website showing their forecasted opportunities. There's about 41 of them that are either new requirements or recompete. So new requirements obviously being things that ICE has not procured before, 16 things that they have been buying over and over again, where they simply know that they have to put it out for bid again. Those contracts, this might be an area, and I'll just tell you, it was just between us girls. It was something that I was able to use AI for as well, because there was such a huge amount of data around what they needed with these requirements, like probably 100 pages of things you could read about these requirements. But the new requirements, the AI was able to summarize for me, is that the new requirements focus on expanding ICE operational capability, particularly through technology systems, data tools, transportation, logistics support, and operational mission support. And then the recompetes are mostly to sustain core ICE operational infrastructure, detention operations, health services, facility management, and program oversight. So I was able to look at a lot of the data after compiling this with the AI, and I pretty much agreed with that assessment. And it sort of makes sense when you think about it, because anything that is expanding the ICE capability would be a new requirement. Any recompete would be to continue doing things that ICE was already doing. So at the end of the day, that makes a lot of sense in terms of the summary that my AI was able to give me on that. Plan contracts by spending range. So we have a table here that shows of the items that are planned to be in procurement. The contracts, and this would be the first two rows of this table, the contracts over $50 million focus on detainee transportation, both air and ground, and the coordination of those activities. Detention facilities and security operations, including management, operations, plant management, staffing. And that is basically it, folks. That would be what is in the pipeline as far as contracts that they plan to have and what is coming down the pike. And so, with that, and I'm just taking a look here, I am almost exactly 45 minutes in, and I am happy to take some questions. And if there are no questions, that's okay too. Certainly, this data will be on YouTube. And I'll just go ahead and tell you now, folks, that all of this data comes to us from a website called USAspending.gov. And so obviously, it took me a lot of time to compile the report and to compile the different data points in what I just presented. But everything that we just talked about, everything that we just went over, is available to you at USAspending.gov, which I feel is a fantastic website, really. If I were to talk about all of, and probably you have felt the same over the years, when you think about a government website, typically a government website will underperform, or maybe it just doesn't work well, or maybe it needs a redesign. USA Spending is at the top of the food chain in terms of functionality and how user-friendly it is for giving the public access to what the federal government is spending. And I believe it's not just only contracts. I think it goes beyond that in terms of maybe grants and such. Um, so I don't have a hard stop, but I'll just sort of say, sort of going once and see if there are questions. So if there are no questions, that means I did a pretty good job. So thank you. Um, I'll just sort of say going once, going twice. Hey, folks, thank you for joining our presentation today. Look for it on YouTube in a few days, and feel free to reach out to me at nick.bernardo@mygovwatch.com if you have questions, and thanks.